Hello friends, welcome back to the new session of advanced course in organizational behavior. Today I am going to start the new module titled Organizational Change and Development. This is a very important topic that I am going to discuss in this session based on globalization, rapid changes, technological changes and economic downturns. This has led organizations to think in a novel fashion. No matter what, whenever organization proposes or introduces any new policy, procedure or any technology in the mechanism of organizations to make the organizations more effectiveness and extremely functional, there is some kind of acceptance also and there is some kind of rejection or resistance, and at the same time this leads to some development. In the whole process, whenever any novelty has been implemented in any organization, the organization again along with the employees goes through a process of change, where some members will accept, some will resist because of certain personal or organizational factors, and some will not take any interest, will exhibit apathy and tend to create some kind of disruption, and finally stabilization is there as well as development. But when we are talking about this change, this development, this is a process. So, how this process takes on, that is more important, because it is not a very straightforward thing to say and do that new technology has been implemented in the system and we have to adapt it. To take the employees and the workers to that stage of adaptation is again a process. Within that process in itself, lot of changes will come, will be encountered, will be resolved, and then we reach to that stage. So, how this change process takes on which leads to the development, that is a core focus of this unit. Therefore, before we talk about that how organizational change and development takes place, it is very important to define that what is a change. Literal meaning we really understand, to initiate something new and then the change can happen. But when we talk from the organization point of view, it has a little bit of different definition. So, I will start the discussion with one question, that how well do I respond to turbulent change? Economic meltdown, economic downturn, new technological changes and advancements, all these are happening every now and then. And as an individual, how I am going to respond and adapt to those changes, that is something to be discussed at individual level and at group level or organizational level, because every time changes happens at individual level, changes happen at professional level or organizational level, and at the same time structural level. So, no company is in a particularly stable environment. Even those with dominant market share must change, sometimes radically. Radically means instantly and importantly. In the present scenario marketplace, even highly established companies have to undergo rapid changes to make them more stabilized. So, that means even established organizations cannot be defined as stable organizations, because they have to compete even after being so stabilized, because every time new changes are occurring, and to adjust to these new changes and global competition, every organization is making some kind of changes in order to adjust, in order to compete. Even Apple, such a proficient IT company which captures the global market, still have to compete with the smaller organizations in order to capture or keep on that hold. So, therefore, change can be initiated to establish the environment and handle challenges that arise for an organization and its members. But what is that change that has to take place? That means making things different in terms of policies, in terms of procedures, in terms of mechanism, in terms of systemic changes, that is structural changes, that how the organization has to function, in terms of technological advancements. When all these changes are introduced, definitely the organization has to undergo some kind of change and development, because we are changing to develop, to keep ourselves stable and at par. So, change or die. This is the rallying cry of the organizations, because when any organization who do not promote this kind of crying, that is either you change or die, that will not enable any organization to compete, to change, to grow and finally to develop. So, what are the forces that stimulate change? That is a generic statement which I have made, that rapid changes in terms of technological advancements, economic downturns, or intense competition or global competition. But there are some existing factors which act as forces which stimulate change, that why people and organizations change. So, the OB professionals have identified some changes which are very much acting as forces that initiate any change in any organization. The first is nature of the workforce. When we talk about nature of the workforce, it is about diversity in terms of gender, in terms of culture diversity, where people tend to move from one country to another, from one city to another in order to gain more knowledge and experience. And whenever people from different and diverse backgrounds come and become part of the organizations, then organizations have to adapt themselves according to the novel workforces. So, this is the first reason that why any change will take place. So, the more there is culture diversity, every organization have to adjust to that multicultural environment, demographic changes, increased immigration, outsourcing and an aging population. If we talk about US workforce, there is an increase in the aging population. If we talk about Indian workforce, there is increase in the young population. So, how to maintain that parity, that employment has to be retained based on diversity, that is culture or multiculturalism, and most importantly in terms of immigration, that is expatriation also takes place, then every organization has to adjust their structure while adjusting with the multicultural workforce. The other is technology. Every now and then new technology comes up and every organization have to adjust and adapt to those new technological changes. Why that change is very important? Because of financial issues, because of intense competition. So, with faster, cheaper and more mobile computers and handheld devices, the emergence and growth of social networking sites has risen up. So, these apps, social networks, this expands the organizational activities in terms of marketing, in terms of interactions. So, technology is continually changing jobs and organizations. It is not hard to imagine the very idea of any office becoming an antiquated concept in the near future. That means, technology will be so much dominating on the workforce that offices, the physical term of offices will also tend to become vague. The other is economic shocks. This is the reason why change happens. Rise and fall of the global markets, maybe housing market, financial sectors and global recession will enable or force any organization to change. If we talk about pandemic, how pandemic led to some major transformations in every organization while reducing the workforces, because they initiated or introduced the work from home policy, which tend the organizations to reduce the workforce. Competition, global competition, mergers and acquisitions, increased government regulation of commerce, all these factors have led organizations to change. So, competitors are likely to come across the ocean as from across town. Successful organizations will be fast on their feet, capable of developing new products rapidly and getting them to market quickly. So, this requires lot of transfer of knowledge, where new expertise are being hired within the organizations, produce more products, maybe technical, non-technical products, and then launch them in the market and then compete. So, global competition is major force that need organizations to bring more changes and adapt to those changes. The other is social trends, increased environmental awareness, liberalization of attitudes towards gay, lesbian and transgender employees, and more multitasking and connectivity. With the introduction of new technological advances, so social trends have also changed. People have become more aware of the companies and the organizations. People are more aware and have become more interactive because of social network sites. They get more exposure to the whole market, and that tends to bring more changes because the organizations have to present themselves in the market. So, these kind of changes which are no more static, which in fact they have become more instrumental in nature, has led organizations to change. So, for example, consumers who are otherwise strangers now meet and share product information in chat rooms and blogs. Companies must continually adjust product and marketing strategies to be sensitive to changing social trends. Initially, when technology was not very advanced, any customer would buy the product and keep it to him. Now, they are more exposed to understand the whole product based on chat rooms and blogs. Even if they purchased any product, they are satisfied or dissatisfied, they tend to post it on social network sites, which make the organizations more conscious about their products, and every time they are bringing more technology and changes in order to refine the manufacturing process. So, consumers, employees and organizational leaders are more sensitive to environmental concerns. Green practices are quickly becoming expected rather than optional, which we have already discussed in the previous module in terms of corporate social responsibilities. So, these are the trends that force an organization to engage themselves in new changing patterns. So, even green practices, which actually points towards engaging organizations in more greener practices, which tend to bring more technology in order to save more energy. And world politics, this is about again global competition. For example, rising healthcare costs, negative social attitudes towards business and executives, and opening of new markets worldwide. So, globalization's strongest proponents could have imagined how world politics would change in recent years. So, it is not only about one country and one organization, it is about global market and global competition. One organization in one country is expanding in another countries globally. So, this forces other countries to involve in global politics, which again formulate global economy, which controls global economy based on rising and market going down, and this brings more changes. So, this is how, for example, we can talk about the rise in power and influence of China and dramatic shakeups in government across the Arab world. These are the examples of these countries who are playing major role in shaking up the global economy at the same place. If we talk about our own country, we are becoming a fast moving economically independent country. So, this is how, based on global competition and global interactions, this has influenced organizations to change to a larger extent in order to make themselves surviving in that intense competition. Therefore, industrialized world's business, particularly in the banking and financial sectors, have come under new scrutiny. So, it is not only about banking and financial sectors, it is about every sector, be it housing, be it financial, banking, or it is FMCG. Any organizations are undergoing massive changes just in order to compete globally. So, these are the factors, that is nature of the workforce, technology, economic shocks, competition, social trends and world politics, that act as forces to initiate any change in any organization. Next comes change, planned change and change agents. Before starting with the discussion, I already mentioned that whenever any change takes place in any organization, it is actually initiation of a process. It is not that change is there and it has been implemented and the employees are being forced to adapt to that change. Basically, a new change will create a new situation where employees tend to give up on something and tend to adjust and adapt something. So, whenever change has been initiated, it is basically a change or planned change and through change agents, but ultimately it will happen through a process. We can just understand these three terms, change, planned change and change agents, based on these examples. The first example, where a group of housekeeping employees who are working in a small hotel confronted the owner that it is very difficult for the female employees to devote morning 7 to 4 work hours, as they have other chores as well to finish. So, it is very difficult for them to continue their job from 7 to 4 in the evening, and then it leads to some kind of ill being which they experience at work, because each one of them have family and personal responsibilities as well, and the working hours become very rigid, which demotivates them and at the same time restrict them to perform their personal responsibilities as well. The owner actually patiently listened to the thoughts of the employees and the groups and ultimatum, and finally agreed to those employees, and next day a flexi time plan was introduced for the employees. So, this is about a change that has been introduced immediately. That means, the above scenario exemplifies change or making things different. So, now here what happened in this example, as soon as the owner introduced the concept of flexi time, the owner was able to retain the talented employees. At the same time, there was a flexi time, so which helped employees to fulfill their personal and family responsibilities. So, this change was so immediate that ultimately change was there and difference was also there, and at the same time there was sense of satisfaction among owner and the employees. Therefore, many change, I like the one that occurred at the hotel, that it occurred immediately and everybody was convinced, they were agreeing to that solution. So, some organizations treat all changes as an accidental occurrence. So, such type of change that has taken, which is a positive change, is an accidental occurrence, and this accidental occurrence has led to adaptability of the employees, and at the same time the owner was also able to retain the employees of that hotel. So, this is one way to introduce change, where change is so positive that employees could adjust and accept immediately. This is about first phase of or another aspect of change, that is accidental occurrence, and it happened, and ultimately every employee was convinced with that change. Alright. Another example which exemplifies that how change is being initiated and implemented at the same time. The previous example led to a change which is an accidental occurrence. In this example, we will talk about a change that has been implemented and how people resisted and accepted also. A major automobile manufacturer spent several $billions to install state of the art robotics. So, one area that would receive the new equipment was quality control. So, to make the process of quality control more precise, they introduced some new equipment along with some technology, where sophisticated computers would significantly improve the company's ability to find and correct the defects. Because the new equipment would dramatically change the jobs in the quality control area, and the management anticipated considerable employee resistance to it, executives were developing a program to help people become familiar with it and deal with the anxiety they might be feeling. So, the higher authorities knew that what change is required, but at the same time they were aware of the workforce that they will resist. So, in order to overcome their resistance to that new change, they introduced some training program where employees could learn those new techniques of quality control and then introduce that change, right. And immediately they would tend to overcome their anxiety. In this example, this is a planned change, that how a new change as a thought was introduced and it was implemented while creating any situation where employees were also involved in a passive manner while undergoing some training and then introducing that change. So, this kind of change is known as planned change, which involves activities that are intentional and goal directed. So, what was the intention? To introduce new technology in quality control department, and at the same time what was the goal orientation? To identify more errors and correct them immediately. So, that was the goal orientation and how employees can be made adjusted to that planned change. Therefore, planned change has two specific goals. The first is it seeks to improve the ability of the organization to adapt to changes in its environment. Why? Because when they are undergoing the training to adapt to the new technology for quality control, a lot of anxiety was scoped by the employees themselves only, because they were becoming aware of that new technology, they were becoming accustomed to that new technology. And second, it seeks to change employee behavior. So, as soon as they are able to adapt to the new changes, overcome anxiety, so they are evolving as a new employee in that area. So, these are the two benefits of planned change, that it improves the ability of the organization to adapt to changes in its environment, and second, it seeks to change employee behavior. Now, the point is that who is going to initiate the change? Change is there, planned change is also there, but who is going to initiate that change? Who is that person? How to identify that one particular person who will initiate change? Thought is there, it has been structured and it has been instrumentalized that how it will be implemented, but who will implement that change will be done by a change agent, right. So, change agent will be the person who is responsible for managing change activities. So, change agents are able to see a future for the organization that others have not identified, and they are able to motivate, invent and implement this vision. Maybe any CEO or any other higher authority has envisioned something for the development of the organization. They would engage in any particular activity to invent and then implement. The person who takes the responsibility is the change agent. So, change agents are the catalyst and assume the responsibility for managing change activities. Why catalyst? Because the person who will act as an agent will be connecting the dots from one person to another, from one technology to another, in order to maintain or streamline the whole process to implement the change. So, he is monitoring, he is motivating and then implementing that change. So, change agent will act as a catalyst to create that mechanism. So, change agents can be managers or non-managers, current or new employees or outside consultants. Any organization can hire outside experts to introduce that change. It can be a non-manager, it can be any retired person as well who has worked in particular organization for so long and who understands all the ins and out of the organizational process and then engage in those new change activities. So, this that who is change agent we can understand better based on this example, that DuPont has two primary change agents, CEO Ellen Kullman and Chief Innovation Officer Thomas Connelly, and these two people join together to bring some change. They are acting as change agent. So, Kullman has pushed the organization towards a higher level of achievement by focusing on a principle Connelly calls launch hard and ramp fast. That was his motto, to change and to grow, launch hard and ramp fast, something with lot of vigor and force and make it through the market. So, this means that the organization will seek to derive as much of its revenues from new products as possible, and the goal is to move DuPont from a comparatively placid culture to one that focuses on market driven size and delivers products consumers need. That means to change the company in order to capture the market and compete with the global competition. So, they focused company to become more market driven, that the product should reach the customers in a very fast manner and with lot of innovation, right. So, the process has not always been easy, but it was necessary to keep the organization ahead of the competitive workplace. So, what was the major orientation or goal of DuPont was to introduce one itself in the marketplace, in the global marketplace as a competitor, and it was only possible through producing products, manufacturing products which reach the consumers as fast as possible and then generate revenue to capture more and produce more. So, this was the vision, but ultimately both the CEOs were the change agents who could introduce this change in the organization. However, many change agents fail because organizational members resist change. Even if we take up the example of DuPont, it was not very easy for both of them to introduce that change, because at every step the employees were resistant to change, right. And why agents fail? The first is our egos are fragile and we often see change as threatening, because we become more accustomed to the already existing mechanism and we create a comfort zone for ourselves. Any novelty that is being introduced in that mechanism will disturb us. It will disturb our ego, it will disturb our mechanism, and we tend to resist change because we are more comfortable in our zone. One recent study showed that when employees are shown data that suggests that they need to change, they latch into whatever data they can find that suggests they are okay and do not need to change. So, this is the counter reaction, that when companies find enough data to convince the employees that need has to be implemented, the counter reaction of the employees is that they will find a data that explains that they do not need change. So, there is so much of contrast in terms of resistance to change. Moreover, employees who have negative feelings about change cope by not thinking about it and increasing their use of sick time and quitting. So, they try to avoid that situation. Whenever they know that change will come to them, they will ignore or they will try to avoid such situations by taking leaves or quitting the job as well for some time. So, these reactions can sap the organization of vital energy when it is most needed. So, in this way, when employees are resistant to change, the organization will pursue the employees, but in the long run, when resistance is going on and on, the organization also loses its vital energy in order to bring that change, and ultimately the change agent fails. Then resistance to change can be positive if it leads to open discussion and debate. There are people, there are employees who are more open to the discussion, maybe they are resistant to change, but maybe to certain extent they will be flexible enough that they will try to understand that why that need is required of change, and they tend to respond positively. So, these responses are usually preferable to apathy or silence and can indicate that members of the organization are engaged in the process, providing change agents an opportunity to explain the change effort. So, no doubt that even organizations are explaining to them, but initially they will show lot of apathy or silence, and apathy are basically non-verbal vocabulary where they are silent when they are not interested, or they will show disinterest in any change, that how that activity will be introduced to bring that change. So, ultimately change agents sometimes fail to bring that change because there are certain psychological factors which we have just now discussed on this slide that demotivate, demoralize or sap any organization or change agent to bring that change. Further, change agents can also use resistance to modify the change to fit the preference of other members of the organization. So, this is a tactful statement that whenever change agents understand that the employees will not change immediately, the change agents will try to consider the interest of the employees and align their interest with the new change. So, that leads to some opening of some interaction that can bring about change or new changes in the system. When they treat resistance only as a threat rather than a point of view to be discussed, they may increase dysfunctional conflict. Now, this is one positive aspect, that maybe the change agent can fit into the preferences of the employees and then bring about the change. But sometimes change agents also threat the employees that this change has to be made and you have to adapt. Then under such circumstances, this leads to conflict between the change agent and the employees, and it leads to dysfunctional conflict. So, there is cessation of organizational activities. Further, resistance does not necessarily surface in standardized ways, it can be overt, implicit, immediate or deferred. So, it is not that it is just immediate, sometimes it will be in staggered manner or maybe in some breaks or intervals, or maybe that is very implicit, that maybe that change is introduced in a very implicit or passive manner, where maybe initially employees will not come to know that how change has been introduced, but it is already there. Under such circumstances, change agent can be successful in bringing that change. It is easiest for management to deal with overt and immediate resistance such as complaints, work slowdown or strike threat, but yes, if it is very much passive, then it becomes difficult for change agents to understand what is going on in their mind, what do they want even if change is there, then it becomes a cold war between the change agent and the employees. But if it is very much overt and explicit in terms of strikes, lockdowns, slowdowns or complaints, then the change agent is in a better position to answer or being accountable for that change. So, the greater challenge is managing resistance that is implicit or deferred responses, that is loss of loyalty or motivation, increased errors or absenteeism. Now, here what happens in deferred responses, that employees know that the change has been introduced or will be introduced. So, while not being explicit, they are more into giving implicit responses where they are quitting the job, they are on sick leave, they are avoiding their job to complete on time, they are not motivated, they are not very much loyal to their task that they are performing, and they perform erroneous job. That means they are performing job with lot of errors. So, this is an impact of change which is very much implicit in nature. So, this is more challenging for the changing agents. So, which are more subtle and more difficult to recognize for what they are. Sometimes even change agents fail to understand such implicit responses, and ultimately they fail to bring about that change or introduce that change. So, what are the sources of resistance to change? So, OB scientists have identified individual and organizational resources, that how certain sources support resistance to change. Some individual factors are habit, that means they are in their comfort zone, they do not want to change, bring any change in their personality, in their routine, and they resist change because they have learned a programmed response to their job. Now, they do not want to reprogram their responses because that require lot of efforts, adjustment and adaptability. So, they want to avoid such kind of changes and stick to their programmed responses. Security. People with high need for security are likely to resist change because it threatens their feelings of safety. So, here when they know some change has to be introduced, it threatens an individual's security because they are not sure and confident that whether they will be able to adapt to that change, and after that insecurity and threat, they also have this threat that maybe they will lose their job. So, in order to avoid such kind of thought process, they tend to resist the change. Economic factors, that changes in job tasks or established work routines can arouse economic fears if people are concerned they won't be able to perform the new task and or routines to their previous standards, especially when pay is closely tied to productivity. So, suppose any assembly line worker who is in a routine job and all of a sudden new technology has been introduced in the process and his salary is completely based on number of units he or she produces in a day, then it becomes a threat to the assembly line worker's job, that what if new technology has been introduced, he fails to adapt and adjust, then maybe he will lose his job. So, this is an economic reason that why people resist to change. Fear of the unknown. Whenever change has been implemented, there is fear of unknown in terms of ambiguity and uncertainty. Employees have no idea that what change will be introduced, what change will be faced in their routine, and there can be some kind of uncertainty in terms of the previous job they are performing, in terms of novelty in their job, even in terms of their salary and pay structure. So, this is fear of unknown. And the last is selective information processing. So, individuals are guilty of selectively processing information in order to keep their perception intact. That means they want to hear what they want to hear and ignore the information that challenges the world they have created. So, if they tend to hear that new change will be introduced, they would like to hear only from people who says that that change will not lead to any threat or insecurity, or no change will be happening in future. So, it is about selective information processing, that they will not resist to they will resist to change, they are not ready for the change, and they will only tend to bank upon those responses or information which say that change will not happen. Based on this information processing, selectively processing information, people bank upon this tendency to change. The other is organizational sources. The first is structural inertia. Organizations have built-in mechanisms such as their selection process or formalized regulations to produce stability. When an organization is confronted with change, their structural inertia acts as a counterbalance to sustain stability. So, whenever any change has been introduced, employees are in a state of inertia. That means there is some force which pulls them back to adapt to that change and to bring some stability. So, when an organization is confronted with change, this structural inertia acts as a counterbalance to sustain stability. So, new change is there, employees have to move forward with that change, but that inertia in form of their comfort zone will pull them back in order to feel more stable rather than entering into that change. So, this is structural inertia in terms of organizational forces that leads to resistance to change. The other is limited focus of change. Organizations consist of a number of interdependent subsystems. One cannot be changed without affecting the others. So, limited changes in subsystems tend to be nullified by the larger system. So, whenever any change has been introduced, the change has to go through the whole process from one system to another, first, second, third, fourth. So, if change has been introduced in system 1, subsystem 1, that the next change will also occur in 2, 3 and 4. But ultimately, when that change is not equal and stable, is not maintaining equilibrium in every subsystem, then it disrupts the whole larger system. So, with this thought that it may disrupt the larger system or the whole organizational process, people tend to, or organizations tend to resist to change. Now, here when we are talking about at organization level, we can talk about any new technological advancement to be introduced and how the whole large system has to undergo that change, right from the 360-degree angle change. The next is group inertia. Even if individuals want to change their behavior, group norms may act as a constraint. So, maybe individual member of any group will prefer to change, but maybe the forces or pressure that they experience from the other members of the group will pressurize him on the other side for not to change. So, the other members expect that one individual member to comply, that not to change. So, group inertia is another factor in organizations where members tend to resist to change. Threat to expertise. Changes in organizational patterns may threaten the expertise to specialized groups. So, even any people or any individual or a group of people who are performing a specialized job, with the introduction of new changes, it will threaten their existence because of their expertise. They become more threatened that how that change will attack their expertise, and maybe they will tend to lose their job. So, this is how that sense of insecurity and threat will also be there to their expertise, that whether their expertise will be required in future or not. And the last is threat to established power relationship. Any redistribution of decision making authority can threaten long established power relationships within the organization. So, whenever any change has been introduced, it is a threat to people or group of people who are power oriented, who are already having power in the organization related to decision making, and if change is there, they will have the fear of losing that decision making power. So, that leads organizations to resist to change, because whenever a change occurs at organizational level, then it actually talks about and thinks about organizational restructuring, maybe at larger level or maybe at a smaller level or group level, but that structural change will lead to some changes to a larger system, and people tend to resist to change. So, these are the certain sources of resistance to change at individual level and organizational level. Therefore, individual sources reside in human characteristics such as perceptions, personalities and needs, because people tend to identify themselves or tend to streamline their personality with the new change, whether their personal behavior is able to adapt or adjust to that new change or not. And organizational sources reside in the structural makeup of the organizations themselves. As I mentioned, that whenever changes occurs at organizational level, it basically speaks about organizational restructuring. To mention, it is worth noting that not all change is good. Speed can lead to bad decisions, and sometimes those initiating change fail to realize the full magnitude of the effects of the true cause. Sometimes change takes place in the organization, in long run it has some negative impact. So, every time we cannot say that change is always good. Rapid transformational change is risky, and some organizations have collapsed for this reason, because maybe lot of money has been invested to bring about the change, maybe technology or maybe hiring new people with new expertise, but somehow the organizations come up with some new marketing strategies and policies and they fail in longer run. Thus, change agents need to carefully think through the full implications of any change. That is why there is a change which is accidental occurrence or it is a planned change, but ultimately change agents have to think about the pros and cons of implementing any change. So, this is about change, planned change, change agents, and how change agents fail because of organizational members and resist change, and certain factors leading to resistance to change. That is all for this session. We will continue in the next class. Thank you so much.